History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom.
Any loose classroom. Any loose classroom. Any loose classroom.
Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining in to Fannie Lou's Classroom, and where we hope to offer you some different food on today that you might be able to grow and learn with us in this dynamic learning community. As you know, Fannie Lou's Classroom is a way for us to not only honor the legacy and the life and ministry of Fannie Lou Hamer, but it's also our opportunity to talk about this intersection of faith, religion, and race. And so we want to have this in politics. So we want to have an amazing conversation on today with the return guest who was phenomenal in season 2. We had to bring her back for a very timely and what I would say a very critical conversation we need to have in the church universal. We need to have this conversation because it impacts so much of our identity, how we identify, particularly how we identify as Christians and how we live out our religion. So we got to have this real amazing conversation on today. But before we do that, I want to remind you, make sure that you let everyone know they can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and our YouTube channel. So have them to subscribe to YouTube, like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and you can now find seasons 1 and 2 not only on our YouTube channel, but you can go to any of your favorite platforms where you watch your other podcasts, and you can catch up on seasons 1 and 2, and you can catch up on season 3 episodes from the previous week. So also I want to remind you, go back and watch last week's episode. It was an amazing conversation. If you missed it, we want to make sure you check that out as well. So last thing, some of you have, well, at least one of you good people have done us the pleasure of purchasing a Fannie Lou Classroom t-shirt. So I want to shout out Phyllis. Phyllis, thank you for your support. We hope you're enjoying. Yeah, give it up for Phyllis. Give it up for Phyllis. She supported us on last week. So Phyllis, not only do you have a t-shirt, but you're going to find some other goodies in your bag. And if you can purchase a t-shirt within this next week, you too can have a blessing to have not only a t-shirt, but a few extra goodies in your bag as you support Fannie Lou's Classroom and this platform. So super excited on today for what we have to share. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our guest. I'm super excited again to have her with us again here in the classroom. We have Dr. I always call you Tamara, but it's Tamara. Because my friend pronounces her name Tamara, and it's spelled the exact same way.
Right.
So we have Dr. Tamara Lewis with us on today. Dr. Lewis is a professor of the practice of historical theology and director of Black Africana Church Studies Program at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. She received her PhD in historical studies from Vanderbilt University and is an ordained elder in the Tennessee Conference of the United Methodist Church. She is a board member of the Wesley Works Project, a member of the Editorial Board of the Methodist Review, and a faculty mentor of the United Methodist Women of Color Scholars Program. She's a member of the steering committee of the Women in Religious Unit of the American Academy of Religion. The author of several peer-reviewed articles and contributor to edited volumes, Dr. Lewis has just completed a monograph on Harry Hosier, early African Methodism, and Black Nihilism. So y'all see she's a heavy hitter. She is also the editor of an upcoming volume of Black Church Studies for the Black and Africana Church Studies Program and of another upcoming publication through Perkins Bridwell Press for the BACS program and Black Seminarians Association. Finally, if that wasn't enough, she is finishing up a book on ontology of race and English Puritanism. Wow. Her current research passion lies in comparative studies of Kemetology, Egyptology, particularly Ancient Kemetic and Egyptian religion, spirituality, and Christian Historical Theology. So now you see, now she is more than qualified to have this conversation on today. But moreover, I also want to say that she is a very proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So I'm excited to have also not only my sister but my soror here on today. She is brilliant, and you're going to hear all this brilliance in the classroom on today. So welcome back, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a blessing to be in the house of God, to be at Friendship West, to be in Fannie Lou's classroom. I truly enjoyed my time. Last time we had a wonderful conversation. I'm just looking forward to continuing sharing and just dialoguing with you as our wonderful hostess. This is just a wonderful time to lift up the knowledge and the teachings that are relevant to our community, to our people, and particularly issues that affect us historically through religion and particularly through the Christian tradition.
Yes,
so, absolutely.
Yes. Well, thank you. And it's so important. And really, this is a continuing conversation because Dr. Haynes, as you know, is adamant, right, about making sure that we're clear about where we got Christianity from.
Absolutely.
And he's clear about making sure we understand that we don't get with the white Jesus, but the right Jesus, right?
Hallelujah.
And so I think this is a platform for us to continue to expand what he preaches on Sunday mornings.
Amen.
It gives us time to really get deeper into what people need to be thinking about.
Amen.
And how we have to let a lot of our assumptions go.
Amen.
And maybe what Big Mama taught us about such and such.
Right.
You know, she knew what she knew during her time, but that's why when we know better, we do better.
Absolutely.
And we have so much more access.
Right.
To information. We have
Yes,
so many
we
more
do.
scholars like yourself who are doing the work in the academy, but not just staying in the academy, but you're connecting to churches and faith communities and people on the ground.
Right.
Which for me, I always say, and that's why I like Fannie Lou's classroom, right? Because I look at Fannie Lou, who did not have formal education, but was very well educated.
Yes, she was.
A well-developed theology.
That's right.
Right, and I think it just shows that we all are able to enter this conversation.
Yes.
Because it's just a matter of doing the work, and most importantly, and what I read throughout your bio, right, is still rooted in spirituality, right?
Absolutely.
It's rooted in spirit. That spirit is never left on the table, and spirit can rest, reside, and work through anybody.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not just in the academy. It's not just in the
Absolutely.
church, and that's why we have to have this conversation and feed off of one another, right?
That's right.
So I said all that to say thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it's just, I'm excited because I think Doc does such a good job at that, but it's like when people leave on Sundays, do you remember all he said?
Right.
Because, you know, we're moving through worship.
Right.
So it's almost like he's on Sundays, and then on Thursdays, what we try to do is connect the dots for people with different issues. So whatever we talk about on Thursdays, you can pretty much see where it connects to what the theology, the theological worldview of Dr. Haynes, we hope comes through as we talk about this intersection of race, politics, and religion, right?
That's so good.
So
That's
super
so good.
excited today. So let's just jump right in.
Yes.
So perhaps let's just start with, because oftentimes you'll see online, I know I've seen online quite often, when Christians may, say a verse or mention God in comments, etc., and people will say, that's what's wrong, you have that slave religion, you got the white man's religion, y'all following a white God and a white Jesus.
Wow.
That's usually their comeback for black people who practice Christianity.
That's right.
So let's just start with let's just start with the basement, right?
Yes,
Tell us why it is incorrect or not even historically accurate,
right,
to have white Jesus.
That's so good. And I just want to say that all of my work and all of my research, I always keep my grandmother in my mind. She is so core to my spirituality and my faith. And my grandmother was not an educated woman. She actually reminds me of Fannie Lou because she was an Arkansas sharecropper's daughter. She never had the opportunity to get a formal education, but she was a woman of faith. And her faith and her wisdom and her knowledge carries me. She's in heaven, but I feel her spirit with me. And that really propels me for everything that I do. Because one of the things my grandmother used to always say, and when she passed, it really brought a tear to my eye. My grandmother was always attuned to the issues of justice for our people. And she never could understand white supremacy in this country in the way that black people had to suffer. She lived through lynchings. Her mother lived through lynchings in Arkansas, the famous Elaine massacre.
Right.
Her father was a sharecropper during that time period, so he was one of the marked men who escaped lynching, but she lived through that, so she was very much aware of the injustices of the world. And she said when she got to heaven, she was going to ask Jesus. She was going to ask Jesus why? We had to go through this. So my motivation to get into church history was to really work through some of these questions because, yes, we have all heard as Christians that Christianity is a white man's religion. And particularly when there have been other movements, other religious movements, people tend to look even at the Black church tradition and said, you know, the Black Christians were the sellouts, and that the people who were taking on other traditions were becoming more true to the faith. Well, it's been a long journey for me, but what I've learned is that even the way that church history has been taught has been appropriated by white supremacy. Therefore, what we learn in our institutions, right, has been a kind of a propaganda movement, the same way that schools and legislatures and all of these PTAs, all these organizations are debating over school curriculum. Knowledge is power. And those who are in institutional, or those who are in societal power realize, why do you think they did not let us read and it was against the law for us to read when our ancestors were enslaved? They knew what they were doing. So the more that I learned about church history, the more that I learned is that Israel, the land of Jesus, the land of Christ, is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Africa itself, okay? And we know that Scripture tells us that Jesus was in Egypt as a child, that his family literally were on the run from King Herod, and they had to shelter in the land of Africa and in a land where they could blend in with the people. What does that say about what our Christ looked like? And particularly when I get into some conversations about some of the earliest images of Jesus that come out of Africa, all of those images are very dark-skinned. The very place where Jesus lived throughout his infancy, before Mary and Joseph were given the sign to go back to their homeland, Galilee, and to settle in Nazareth, that's place in Egypt, which was an early Christian center. The earliest images of Jesus are very, very dark-skinned. So we know just from the geographical area, we know from the proximity to Africa and to Egypt, and we know of the physical features of people even further back, even compared to now, because in 2,000 years, there's been a great deal of geographical mobility. There've been a great deal of changes, but at that time, you're dealing with very, very dark-skinned people, okay? So from that beginning, we're already starting with a man, a family, a community that was deeply connected to Africa, spent time in Africa. There was a huge Jewish community in Africa. And in terms of their physical appearance, they blended in with the rest of the community and the people in Africa. This is a place where the sun is burning down 24 hours. And there's got to be some layer of melanin, okay? Because it is not natural to live in these spaces. And particularly 2,000 years ago, it just simply was not the case. You did not have huge populations of people who, what we would describe today as white. Quite honestly, it just simply didn't exist. It was not the case. So we're aware geographically, just knowledge of what was going on in that space. And we're also aware that some of the earliest images that are emerging of Jesus were very, very dark skinned. So the first thing I want to say is that because Jesus came from a Jewish community, they followed very closely the Torah. And even in the Galilee and even in Judea, they were close followers of the Torah. And we are familiar with the Ten Commandments, right, as the legacy of being Christians. And we probably all grew up reciting the Ten Commandments. Well, the second commandment is Exodus 20:4-6. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. What this meant is the Jews of the first century, which is Jesus' community, did not have representations of themselves, did not have art in their synagogues or in their public spaces, in the temple in Jerusalem, or in their homes. It was against Torah. It was against the Mosaic law. And so this is one of the reasons why we don't have a physical representation of Jesus from that time period. You didn't have a physical representation of observant Jews, of devout Jews, as Jesus was, and from the community that he came from. They just simply didn't exist. We do know that there are scriptural references that the earliest Christians who followed Jesus and immediately after Jesus' resurrection would appeal to think about the significance of Jesus' physical appearance. So, for example, Isaiah 53:2. He had no form nor comeliness that we should look upon him, nor beauty that we should delight in him. And this is because the early Christians believed and taught that the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micaiah, all of these prophets were testifying to Jesus Christ as a Messiah. And so they utilized these scripture to stress the fact that his physical appearance to them at the time was not the important issue. He was the Savior. He had come among us. God with us had come to dwell among us and to be humble, to be one of the people who empathized with the people, and who was very unique in his time for recognizing the dignity of every human person, man, woman, and child. And this actually made him a target in his own community. So the earliest Christians were well acquainted with Jesus' physical appearance. There's also an indication that Jesus looked very much like his community and his disciples. If you remember when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and the soldiers come, the whole story with Judas Iscariot having to kiss Jesus is because the soldiers could not determine out of all the disciples, which one is Jesus? He was one of the crowd. He was one of the people. He was one with his brothers. He was one with his sisters. And so human obsession with the external, the physical, the comeliness of the world and society, and even today when we emphasize the external appearance, Jesus was not about the external appearance. He was about the heart, and this was the power of his ministry. But as time went by, as you know, people began to wonder. People began to ask questions, particularly as the Christians moved out of just the Jewish community into the Gentile community, as they began expanding in their preaching, in their evangelization, and they began to communicate and proselytize or preach and tell the story, tell the gospel. People began to wonder, who was this man? What did he physically look like? And you may be familiar with, or you may have heard, that there are many images in churches all over Western and Eastern Europe. And these images are of what is called the Black Madonna and Child.
So Dr. Lewis, put a pin there because I want to get to the iconography, but you said so much. So it's generated some more questions.
Yes, please.
But the first comment I want to make, because you spoke to how history is taught.
Yes.
And how that's so important. And I remember when I was in seminary, getting my MDiv, we had the thick History of Christianity 1 and 2.
Oh my God.
So you put them both together, right? Well over 1,000 pages.
Right.
And I remember, I don't know if it must have been volume 2 perhaps. I've already did first half. So I'm going through the second half. Now, you put them together. So we're talking about a book this thick, probably buried. And it was only maybe 2 or 3 sentences. It said that the Europeans went to evangelize into Africa.
Oh my God.
But they discovered they already knew who Jesus was.
Absolutely.
Now, how is that in the middle of the history of Christianity with 2 or 3 lines? And I remember highlighting that like crazy. But how do you have this thick book if you put them together, like volumes 1 and 2, the history of Christianity, but yet you have that little line there, because that says something to me.
It absolutely says something.
Which made me also remember as I was sitting here when I took your class one summer, and you told us about St. Mark.
Yes.
Who went to speak and visit in Ethiopia.
That's right.
So, I said all that to say history and geography go together, right?
Yes.
And we're talking about this. And this is something that I read the other day, to your point, about, which is why I think sometimes it's just a matter of read your Bible.
Yes, that's so true.
That's so true. If you read your Bible, then get a map. Because they can change the words in the book, but you cannot change
the Bible. Then you cannot. It's there.
And you can't change geography. That piece of land is still there.
It's still there.
And this is what I ran up on. And it says Israel is a part of Africa. Israel is on the African or Nubian tectonic plate.
That's right.
Just like Egypt.
That's right.
It is a different landmass than Saudi Arabia. So they say, for example, Saudi Arabia is on the Arabian tectonic plate. Israel is on the African tectonic plate. So Israel is a part of Africa, but not Saudi Arabia, right? And I think that's so important, right? That's just nobody can change that.
No one can change that. But what has happened is that is not taught that way.
Right.
So that fundamental geographical fact is there, but the way it's taught in our schools, even in our seminaries, the division, so-called division of Israel from Africa is a political division, not a geographical division, as you so rightfully are stating.
Right, and even the Middle East, like I tell people, calling it the Middle East is
not the middle.
A political term.
It's a misnomer.
Right, it's no such thing as
there's no such thing.
And every time even things like CNN, and I think sometimes I read, Foreign Affairs magazine or The Economist, and it's always Africa, Egypt, Middle East.
Oh my gosh.
No, and how people just say it so fluently now, right?
They do.
Is that so? Part of it, in my opinion, is returning to and reclaiming the truth.
Absolutely.
And so we have to constantly put that out in the general public, right? To your point, as we're telling this history, and even those who stand and preach the word.
Yes.
Right. It's their responsibility to tell the truth in this moment and not say, well, it doesn't matter. Because if it didn't matter, it never would have changed.
That's right.
It matters for a reason.
It matters.
So I didn't want to run past. I just remember that about my theological training at Bright, right?
Yes.
Reading that book. I was like, now how is this buried just 2 little lines?
That's right. That is absolutely
And then I remember sitting here, the class I took from you, and I think it was Pan-African Christian Resistance.
Yes.
And it was, so I read so many books since then just from that class. And I remember you talk about St. Mark. I was like, wow.
Yes.
And, we talk about the church fathers. I don't want to get too much academic here, but I think it's important for people to know. A lot of what you hear people preaching, they talk about Tertullian, they talk about Augustine. These were not white church fathers as many are now making them to be. These were North Africans.
They were North Africans. They were absolutely North Africans.
And I think that's important to say. So if you hear somebody preaching about that, you won't think that a white person then shaped and framed these thoughts, that these were Africans thinking. And I remember one of my classes, the question was asked, can you all think of any African theologians? So me, I raised my hand. I said, you just named 3. And so the whole room got quiet. right? So, but you see what I'm saying? How it's kidnapped that is.
It's absolutely.
And so this leads me to, now I'm going to shift a bit. It's going to get to iconography too. Howard Thurman, right? The great mystic, theologian. I love Howard Thurman. You can't go wrong with Thurman, right? But in Jesus and the Disinherited, at the very outset of his book, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, many and varied are the interpretations of the life, times, and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And very few of those interpretations have little to say to those who have their backs against the wall.
Exactly.
So now I think I want to shift into, why has Jesus changed? Why has this identity, what's this political move that kidnapped, Jesus of Nazareth's true identity? Because that mattered. Because it matters.
It does matter.
Just based on what you said. So let's talk a little bit about why the politics around that and how that's been used, which includes iconography. So if you want to start with images, you can do that and kind of talk about how we even see that in maybe contemporary art.
Right?
TV,
yes,
movies,
yes,
etc.
yes.
So however you want to run with that, but I just unpack the importance of why we have to have the right interpretation
Right, absolutely.
of Jesus of Nazareth.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much. You know, you made something really, really clear when you stated just now about the division of Egypt from Africa, the way that language is used in the media and the news, and it's just so common. I had a friend, I remember years ago, who told me of her visit to Africa, and when they went to Egypt, they were there, and they were visiting with some of the Egyptians, and they were making a tour of the entire continent. And so as they were preparing to leave, she told me, one of the women said, "Oh, you all are going into Africa now." So even in Egypt, there is this distinction, this perception that we're not part of Africa. But it's so important to understand the history. Why is that the case? Okay, and we know that Jesus, again, going back to our Bible, just, you know, the basic things that we know, and connecting this to history. Even though there were Jewish elites who were jealous of Jesus because of his love for the people, his miracles, his work, and because he was the Son of God, that they instigated the Romans, right? The Romans to execute Jesus. Jesus was killed by the Roman Empire, right? And the beginning of the movement, the earliest movement, women and men were very active in continuing the ministry of Jesus. As Jesus said, "You will do even greater things than I do. And, you know, I commission you to continue my work, to continue my ministry." And this is what they did through many trials and tribulations. We have this even in the Acts of the Apostles. The people are striving. And what they represented was a movement that was against Roman oppression.
That's right.
Right? But something happened along the way. Right? As the centuries went by, first century, second century, third century, there began to be splinters among many of those who had inherited, the inheritors of the Jesus movement. And you have to think about it. It's hard to have your back up against the wall all the time. Some people don't want to do it. Some people want to find ways to assimilate, conform, co-opt, give up the struggle, because the followers of Jesus were persecuted just as Jesus was. Right. They suffered just as Jesus was. There's a story in church history where many may or may not know, but Peter was crucified upside down. According to church history, many of the disciples were crucified. Many of them were beheaded. There's one of the disciples, his skin was flayed off his body. Horrible stories. And many of the inheritors of the tradition says, maybe we can find a better way. Maybe we can find a way of accommodating. Maybe we can still follow Jesus, but we can cut corners, Are
you talking about 3rd century or 2023?
That's what has happened in the tradition very early on. And so they started giving over, they started accommodating. And this happened, it just takes a little, a little bit, but it sort of builds up momentum over time until you get to the 4th century. And when you get to the 4th century, you have all of the work that many of these individuals have been doing to accommodate, right? And when they did so, they found themselves being accepted by the empire, the government, the system, the very system that had executed Jesus. That same system and institution, it had not changed. But many church people had changed. Many Christians had changed. And with that shift, then you begin to see compromises that have passed down. I was listening to a talk by a actual Roman Catholic nun, and who is also a church historian. And she said, she used this language, she said, by the 4th century, the church became corrupt. the church became corrupt. And there are even stories, we talk about Rome being the center of the church in the Roman Empire. The bishops of Rome were centered at Rome, and we associate Italy now with what? The mafia.
Right.
If you read church history, you have stories. It's all documented. Stories of bishops, of popes having rivals, having enemies. They didn't pray for them or go and
Right.
minister to them and sit down with the right hand of fellowship. This language. They would hire no other word to say, thugs, to go out and rough up their enemies. I mean, this is like hardcore politics. They have truly assimilated into hardcore politics. And what happens now is, of course, the Roman Empire has colonized all of what we call, of course, erroneously, the Middle East, has colonized North Africa, has colonized what we call Egypt today, has colonized parts of Europe, and it was Rome that divided what we now call today Egypt and Africa. So it goes back to colonialism. It goes back to imperialism, right? The same kind of oppressive structure, because they are going into lands where historic dark-skinned African people have lived, and with their military might, they're moving things around and they're renaming. The same thing that colonizers have continued to do, right? Transport people, dispossess people from their land, rename. And so this is how we have this division going into church history, coming down through the years, the division between Egypt and Africa. Jesus was one of the people, and he was dark-skinned like the people, because we know that some of the earliest images that are coming out of Egypt are the Black Madonna and Child. And so this is a reflection of who Jesus is. So let me speak to all my brothers and sisters who may think this is a white man's religion.
Right.
The idea that it's a white man's religion is propaganda. Just like propaganda has been proliferated all throughout our educational institutions. We have had to relearn, Carter G. Woodson, we have to, unlearn.
That's right.
All of this damaging brainwashing and conditioning that has been used to keep us in mental oppression, right?
Right.
Just like Bob Marley, we have to free ourselves from mental slavery.
That's right.
Because slavery is not just of the body, it's of the mind, Right. And this is what the colonizers are doing, and this extends even to the Christian tradition. The Christian tradition is steeped in blackness because the images, the iconography, the paintings, the representations of Jesus are dark, coming out of that part of the world. So what I do want to say is, as the disciples began to move in other parts, as they began to move up into Europe, as they begin to move in towards the east, you begin to have representations of Jesus that look like the people in those places. And so Jesus becomes lighter skinned because it's a representation of how the people saw themselves. Even when you go far east, Jesus was in India, or representatives of Jesus, disciples of Jesus were in India, they were in China, and their images of Jesus in China in the 4th, 5th, and century were Jesus is Chinese. Jesus is literally Chinese in ancient images of Jesus. So people are creating Jesus in their own image. They don't have an actual historical reference. And the power of Jesus, even as you know in our faith, we identify with who Jesus is, right? He's a reflection of us. And people were drawing images of Jesus in which, he looked like them. But the earliest images, and we know they're the earliest because these are the images of the Black Madonna that are very, very ancient. Those are the earliest images and representations of Jesus that we know of, and that tells us that Jesus was very dark-skinned.
Yeah, and I think to your point, we have to get the history right.
Exactly.
I think it's Jacob Carruthers in his book Intellectual Warfare that talks about historicide.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so that's what's has happening and is happening. And so when you directly talked about who were our audience, right? We're letting our Black brothers and sisters know, right, that Jesus was a Black man.
Jesus was a Black man. He was. If we could somehow physically resurrect his body, and he were walking down the street, someone would say, "Who's that Black man? Who's that brother? Who's that walking down the street?"
Because much like, as you know, when you go to Africa or even throughout the Americas,
right,
in the Caribbean, you probably experienced this traveling. When I've gone to Africa, they just started talking to me. So I started talking. Oh, you American?
Yes.
Like so they'll really start speaking like I was in Brazil recently. They'll walk up, start speaking Portuguese. I'm like, no hablo Portuguese.
Yes.
Not even a bit, right?
Yes.
And I think to your point, that's the same way. And why? And we had this conversation, I believe, 2 shows ago about the need for us, right, for Black folks to reach out to Africa, for Africa to reach out to us,
gosh.
right? This idea of this diasporic community, we are a collective.
Absolutely.
And so, because when we don't do that, right, and so Dr. Haynes would say historicide leads to what Bobby Wright calls menticide.
Yes.
So now our brains don't even belong to us.
They don't.
Right, and we think they do, but they really don't. So I want to then talk about now, maybe the best way to enter this conversation, because now we'll kind of bring it, well, let's not come so much in 21st century. Let's kind of move from, because you had us read this book. I read it maybe twice since you assigned it, 5 years ago. But it's I think it's Joan Thornton. Thornton is the last.
Yes.
And the book is Africa and Africans that shaped the Atlantic world from the 1400s to 16 something other.
Absolutely.
And I remember one chapter, I underlined it, highlighted it, and so because I think I want to bring this to America, right? So now let's talk about the ways in which, because you kind of very brilliantly laid out the origins and how that over time that changed and evolved.
It did.
Where the kidnapping.
Exactly.
Where that interpret, Thurman would say that many and varied interpretations began to happen. But I remember reading one thing he said. Now this is long before Europeans knew how to navigate the waters and even get to Africa.
Right.
That Africans, West Coast, Gold Coast, it wasn't, because you really broke down Africa to us too, and what we call it and all that good. You broke it down, right? So for the sake of just a conversation, I'm gonna call it West Africa, right?
Right.
That the Africans already had, which we know, well-developed.
Oh, absolutely.
Religious systems. And they wouldn't even call them, religious systems also Western construct too. So, but for the sake of the conversation, I'm going to call it, religious systems. Well-developed, who God was. They understood God to be, not bound by buildings, but God is in everything. God is everywhere.
Absolutely.
And so when the Europeans finally found their way to the West Coast, it was an exchange of who the divine was. But it wasn't until they started to say, oh, y'all got gold. Oh, y'all have.
Yes, we're going to take advantage.
So now they begin to put in books for them.
Oh, yes.
This is who God is. And if you say anything outside of what we say it is, that's demon. We're going to demonize it.
Oh, yes.
It's evil. It's of the devil, etc.
Absolutely.
Right? And so for me, I think that's where we have to know that happened.
Yes, absolutely.
And to understand. And so we know this from, those slave ships that made their way through the Americas and the Caribbean, that there were Muslims on those slave ships. There were Christians.
Yes.
There were those who had to practice traditional African religions, etc. Right. I mean, you can go to Hilton Head and some of those places on the East Coast, in those churches, you can see the Arabic inscription on the pews. And the ways in which,
powerful.
And what that tells me also is while we're trying to battle this the white man's religion, I believe our ancestors, right, is that Thurman's question of what manner of spirit existed in the hull of that ship.
Oh my God.
That made people who may have been Christian, Muslim, traditional African religions survive.
Yes.
And recreate and reimagine how they're going to make it in this new world. Because somewhere I still believe there was a common thread about who God was, right?
Absolutely.
This understanding, because they all had their own culture, language, history. They were not all the same.
That's
but
right.
It was what manner of spirit
allowed
that to happen. And I feel like today, that what manner of spirit he would be confused today.
Oh my gosh.
And the ways in which we are not being able to be truth tellers.
Right.
In order to come together as a collective.
Oh, wow.
So just talk to us about, right, how you kind of laid out how that, how we say that kidnapping, whitewashing of Jesus happened.
Yes.
So now let's talk about when we came to the shores.
Right.
In the early Black church, without walls, down in those hush harbors,
right,
that would have been more connected to those who came over on the ships. So talk to us a little bit about how we began to fall into that Christianity is a white man's religion. Because I think it's something when people may not think this, but I believe it just mentally, psychologically, if my image of Jesus is white and I see God as a white male, whether I say it or not, I just believe that's playing out in everyday life, how I see myself, how I see others, and how I see what it means to be human.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so just
you are right on target. And so I just want to just add something, just a little bit of just history,
yes,
how they changed Jesus, the Europeans, how they changed Jesus. So just wanting to stress Jesus' original Blackness, and wanting to mention, for example, the Ethiopian Jesus. Ethiopia, Christianity very early, as you know. And one of the things I love so much about the Ethiopian, very, very ancient, much more ancient than European Jesus, right? So Jesus was in Ethiopia before he was in Europe. Okay, so that just, just keep us on point with that, because this is the Europeans sort of propagated this notion that somehow they had originated Christianity and they were bringing Christianity back to Africa when it had always been there, right? So what I love about the images of the Egyptian Christ and disciples is they have afros. I love that, right? And it means just that round. But that brings us to the image of the halo, because this would become very key in European images of iconography, identifying Jesus, right? The halo, because similar to that scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, you have representations of Jesus in churches all over the world, where Jesus is standing with Peter and Paul and other disciples. How do you make out Jesus? So it's the distinguishing mark would be the halo, and then there would be different shapes of halos. For example, the mother of Jesus, right? She would have another shape of a halo. The halo is an African symbol. The halo is the sun, and it goes back to the ancient way of our ancestors who acknowledged the power of God's creation. And for them, they recognized the beauty of nature, certainly not the way that later Europeans saw nature as something to be dominated and conquered and controlled. They saw nature and the beauty of creation as manifestations of the one God. And so when they looked at the sun, they marveled at God who created such an amazing and powerful instrument that led to the fertility. They understood what later scientists call photosynthesis, right? They understood all of these mechanical scientific aspects of nature that led to the fertility and the sustenance of the land and therefore God's people and God's animals. So the halo for them, or the sun, was a representation of the holiest sort of symbol, right? Representing God. When the Mediterraneans and then the Europeans come into the province of what we call Israel, quote unquote, the Middle East extension of Africa, they simply just take that image. They just take it and they put it into their art. And we see this during the Roman Empire. So there's this constant borrowing and taking directly from Africa. African symbols, African representations, Madonna and Child, they are taking this directly into European art. There is nothing new in European representations and even in their theological doctrine that did not come out of Africa. As you mentioned, Tertullian, Augustine, Origen,
right.
Cyprian.
Yes.
These are the core theological thinkers that lay the foundation for Christian thinking that is going to dominate all of the so-called white world. Not only were these men North African, but these men were very much connected to their Black African roots. For example, Origen was half Black, what we would call half Black. He had a Black mother and a Greek father, and he was very much tied to his African identity, which is one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic Church refused to ordain him, because he sanctify him, make him into a saint, because he was so tied to his African roots. Augustine had an African mother and a Roman father, and we believe he was mixed, the same thing, and he struggled with his own identity, but he very much understood his African roots. These are the men who are laying the foundations. Athanasius, the man who determined the literal canon of the Bible, the New Testament that we read now, he wrote the final list in the 4th century that would become the New Testament. His enemies called him Black Dwarf. Black Dwarf, because he was so dark-skinned, and they thought that was a way of, putting him down. This man literally laid out his festal letter. I believe it's 367 are the final books that would go into our New Testament. So just wanting to emphasize over and over again how Black Christianity is. Christianity is Black, and the deeper you go, it gets blacker and blacker. Okay.
So the deeper you go, the blacker it gets.
The blacker it gets. Okay?
Listen, once again, we have Dr. Tamara Lewis. I just got to say her name again because she is dropping so much knowledge, and I don't want us to miss it, because I think it plays very much into our current way in which we view church.
Yes.
The way we have church, and the way in which Black folks run from.
Right.
Trying to say Jesus is Black.
Oh my gosh.
So so let's use this as an entry point, because I want you to break that down too, and what that means, just theologically, what it means, how we understand ourselves as Christians.
Yes.
And how that may play into why we then call people like a Dr. Haynes or Jeremy Ray Jr. Radical and not Christian. So you probably have it somewhere. I know you probably would say this, but I'm going back to Good Times. Season 1, episode 2, Black Jesus. So the way in which
I love it. No,
hey,
I love it.
I keep up with the good shows.
Yes.
No matter how old they are, because Good Time was a show about race and politics, in my opinion.
Yes, it was.
Race, politics, and religion.
It absolutely was.
And the issues of the day that plague Black people.
Absolutely.
Whether it was rent.
Absolutely.
Non-functioning schools that weren't resourced, etc.
Exactly.
But Black Jesus on the wall. So JJ painted. They said it was Ned the Wino. But Michael said it was Black Jesus.
It was Black
and so
Jesus.
You know the story, right? So they took white Jesus, that long flowy hair, that brunette, off the wall, put Black Jesus up. James hit that one in the hole. And he was like, it was because of Black Jesus.
It was because Black Jesus.
But the point I think the show was trying to make, in my estimation, was also this notion of, who is Jesus really?
Who is Jesus?
And for the Evans family, particularly for Michael, he Black.
He is Black. Well, we know that Europeans borrowed all of these concepts, and then they baptized, or I would say they demonized Jesus into whiteness. And this goes back to the famous image of Leonardo da Vinci. This is when Jesus becomes white. So in the Mediterranean, Jesus was white. He had dark hair. It was kind of like he looked Arabic when they sort of made the switch from darker. But then when they went into Italy, what's interesting is Leonardo and others, they used representations of their cousin, their brother, whoever was walking down the street, becomes very, very white. Now, when the Europeans make their way to West Africa, they are bringing these white images of Jesus. And we know that Africans were already Christian. There's this revolutionary scholarship that is talking about Christian movements within Africa from east to west that predated Europeans. But when Europeans came to West Africa, they brought their European version of Christianity. They had already whitewashed it over the centuries. And this would have been the images that the Africans who were pushed onto the slave ships, they would have seen these white images of Jesus, and they definitely saw those white images of Jesus once they got to America, and many of them did worship in churches with their masters. Whether they did or they did not, they would have seen these white images of Jesus, and many of them would have carried them on into their own black churches after the Civil War. So we know that there are churches, and there are churches to this day that still have images of white Jesus in their church.
Stained glass.
It's stained glass, and I won't say any names, but there are churches that still have images of white Jesus, and this is a concern, but it's that legacy. And I say all this to connect to Florida, right? In that episode, right?
Yeah.
Because she was the one, that was holding on to that white Jesus, and was not able to let that white Jesus go until Michael and JJ are really trying to help her understand. Even quoting Revelation, in the episode, Michael, right?
His hair was like wool.
Right.
Feet as brass. Right. So Michael he's standing there. It's almost like that Nat Turner in the movie the Nat Turner movie, Birth of a Nation.
Oh, yes.
Right? When he's going back and forth with the white man.
Yes.
Right? He got his book, you got your book, let's go.
Let's go.
And so Michael's telling his mother, see mama right here.
Right.
That Bible you tell us we ought to read.
That's right.
So in Florida also mentioned that's the Jesus that she's ever known.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
And so to your point about the churches, see, I think there's a lesson from the ancestors even this moment. Because before they went into, because earlier on we know they had to go worship. They had in the balcony.
That's right.
But they had enough sense to say, I see that Jesus, but we're going to go down here into this bush.
They had enough sense, right?
And we're not going back to the bush because we are in the house and we're not leaving it.
Right.
We got a choice now. You don't have to go there. So to your point, because you're starting to bring it up, now to 2023,
yes,
and connecting that to, what's happening in the moment. And the Jesus we follow is important, because if you're following the white Jesus, you're going to think Friendship West is out there. Yeah, you're going to think, we don't need to talk about politics and religion doesn't go together, when the fact is everything is political.
Everything is political.
And let me tell you, and I'm going to name this First Baptist downtown, Robert Jeffrey. You don't think he's political?
Oh, my gosh. Unapologetically.
Meanwhile, we don't say anything. We don't need to talk about that in church. Okay.
What's really interesting about that is that goes back to our history. I was thinking about this earlier this morning. Even the way many of our ancestors, or even many of in our black community, are misinformed. A lot of this comes from historical trauma, right? Right. It comes from historical trauma because black folks, even during slavery days and even immediately after, would gather in their churches, and those pastors, and this is even immediately, in your hometown of Memphis, there's a whole lot of history that happens right after the Civil War. Those pastors and those leaders who are speaking out in favor of blackness, of liberation, of our community, of self-sufficiency, of all of these things that are happening, what happens? They're run down, they're run out of town, they're lynched, all of these things are happening. There was even a common thing that would happen moving into the early 19th century, where there would be certain white people in the community assigned to go around to all the black churches during worship. And a lot of them would stand outside the door and just listen to see what the pastor was saying. But some of these white men would just walk into the church and go sit up in the pulpit. And the whole message was, we are listening.
That's right.
To you, and don't mention politics. Don't mention, just talk about this white Jesus in the sky,
which is a further indication, right, that they have a dualistic theology.
That's right. Very dualistic. Right.
They separate God from the body from soul.
Absolutely.
Right. And that really their version of Christianity is really political.
It's always,
because to walk in the church and go up to the pulpit also means that you don't honor the sacred, nothing that's holy and sacred. And to your point, and it's a Mr. Black folk. I don't care how much you in here praying to the God we claim we serve.
Right.
I'm gonna bust up in your service without any regard to what's sacred up in here and just post up in this pulpit.
They would absolutely
and particularly
do it.
with the pulpit meant. And we go in the Black church, and particularly with that meant, like, this is the place where we come, or this is the only place we have, we really control,
Exactly.
that we own, that we do come
Right.
to plan, to strategize,
Right.
to birth institutions, et cetera, right? And so, and I think that's what, talk to us about that, because I think I really want us to, as we conclude and round this great conversation with me, you got to do another one.
Yes, we can never get it right.
We can never get enough of constantly telling the truth.
We have to tell the truth, and this is a trauma that we're working with, because they were very political, but it was the political and the religious, because they were teaching a doctrine that Black people were inferior.
That's right.
They were teaching a doctrine that Black people were cursed, and they were even teaching a doctrine that this, to your point of the division between the body and the soul, that if you're good in this life, according to whiteness, right, you'll go to heaven. But not only will you go to heaven, but if you're good, God will make you white in heaven. They literally are teaching this. So our ancestors have been exposed to this, and this is why this platform is so powerful, and what you're doing is so commendable. And everything that I want to do is just lift it up, because this is the liberation that people need to understand, to do the work, to heal from that collective trauma and reverse this confusion and this misunderstanding of the way we have been indoctrinated into this being a white religion. And that is the lie.
And that is the lie.
A white religion. It is a religion of liberation for our people, because it originated among our people.
And that's a good place to say, to be continued,
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for being with us again. Let's give it up for Dr. Lewis for being with us again on Family Lewis Classroom. We're going to have to continue this conversation.
Absolutely.
And have it multiple times, so check it. You see how powerful Dr. Lewis was.
Oh, God bless you.
You know we try to bring you the best folks to have these very timely, relevant conversations that impact our community as it relates to religion, race, and politics. And you can help us by keeping it going. You can purchase a Family Lewis Classroom t-shirt. Simply go to friendshipwest.org, click on social justice, and you will see a Family Lewis Classroom tab, and you can order your t-shirt from there. And when you order, we'll make sure we get that t-shirt to you in a timely fashion. And you can also help us by making sure you spread the word. So let people know you can subscribe to YouTube, Family Lewis Classroom on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and again, wherever you may find your popular podcasts, you can find us there as well. Amazon Music, where else? We're on Spotify, and sure, like, I don't know, don't ask me. So check it. Yeah, anywhere you find your favorite podcast, you can find Family Lewis Classroom there. So a couple things to wrap this up. You don't want to miss next week. You do not want to miss next week. We're going to have Dr. Karen Crozier with us.
Oh.
Yes, and she wrote, yes, come on, give it up for her ahead of time, because she's going to be bomb too. So you see this amazing, brilliant Black woman today. You're going to get that again next week in Dr. Crozier. She has a book called Fannie Lou Hamer's Practical Theology.
Wow.
I'm sorry, Fannie Lou Hamer's Revolutionary Practical Theology, Race and Environmental Justice Concerns. And your amazing guests for that show are going to be the Fannie Lou Classroom crew. It's going to be me, Cheryl, and Shanika. We're going to break down her book with her, Dr. Crozier's book with her, probably look at some particular chapters so we can celebrate Fannie Lou Hamer's genius. So we're going to break her book down to learn all about who this woman was, because I say she wasn't just a civil rights activist.
Oh my God.
She was a human rights activist. She was a revolutionary. She was unapologetically Black and unashamedly Christian. She loved all her Blackness as a Black woman, and we're going to lift her up and really talk about her life. So make sure you tune in next week. Tell everyone else we want to celebrate Fannie Lou Hamer on next week. So just a couple of events coming up. One at Friendship West, the other Friendship West supporting. The first one is Be Well, Black Reproductive Justice and the Faith Community. A seminar about Healthy Start will take place this Saturday at 9 o'clock a.m. If you go to our Instagram pages, it's there. The registration is free, and I'll be serving as the keynote speaker at that event, and it starts at 9 o'clock a.m. The next thing is, every year we have our Friendship West, here at Friendship West, we host our annual Broughton Wells Lecture Series, and that is named after Virginia Broughton and Ada Bell Wells Barnett, who y'all know is my shero next to Fannie Lou Hamer. And so, because they so much represent, right, what it means to be unapologetically a Black woman and stand in your power and have agency, right? That woman is second, woman is 10. They were radically subjective. And so we honor that in this lecture series. So we're excited about this year. We're going to continue to focus on, as our Broughton Wells Center for Gender Justice has been focusing on lately, is reproductive justice. And more specifically, we have been advocating for and raising awareness around Black maternal mortality and morbidity rates. That Black women are 3 times more likely to die after giving birth to a child than white women. So it's an epidemic in this country. Yes. Nobody is raising awareness of that. Right. So if you are a woman, if you are a man, if you self-identify, if you have a sister, you have a niece, if you love Black women, we need you to be here Tuesday and Wednesday, October 10th and 11th, because it takes the entire community to be a part of this conversation. So on Tuesday, we're going to do a screening and discussion of Aftershock, which is a documentary that follows the lives of 2 Black women who died from complications of childbirth that were 100% preventable. And so we're going to hear their stories as well as a call to action. So that's going to be on Tuesday, October the 10th. And we're going to also honor and recognize our state representative, District 110, Representative Tony Rose, for her tireless work and the ongoing sessions that we've had in Texas trying to pass legislation that does more to give protection for women who give birth to children. And so we're just going to honor all her sacrifice over sessions to get things passed, because this past session she was part of getting HB 12 passed, which extends care for mothers from 6 months to 12 months, because what's recommended is 12 months care of follow-up. Go figure, in the U.S., a so-called first world country, women are dying from childbirth in 2023. So we want to make sure that we are educated, that we raise awareness so that we can then move to some form of activism to make sure Black women survive the moment. Then on Wednesday, you definitely don't want, man, we did all these amazing Black women roll through Friendship West. Because on Wednesday, we're going to have Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo. You don't know, Google her. That's
my sister.
Yeah, so you got to come out on Wednesday night to support her.
I am.
So on Wednesday night, 7:00, we normally do Theology Matters on the second Wednesday of the month here at Friendship West. You do not want to miss Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo, and we're going to talk from the subject, Have You Got Good Religion? Wow. And that's based on her upcoming book. I believe it's going to be released next year, I believe in 24. So just Google her. You'll see why you want to be here to hear what this Black woman has to say. So again, this Saturday, September 12th, you can register. It's free to come. And it's about how the faith community has a responsibility to talk about reproductive justice. Absolutely. That we don't just think it's about abortion. That it's so much more than that. And if we're going to have life and have it life more abundantly, the church has not just something to say, but something to do. And then, of course, check out our lecture series on October 10th and 11th. Until then, we'll see you on next week. Make sure you join us 12:00 noon. You missed the noon broadcast. We'll rebroadcast at 7:00 Central Standard Time. Be blessed, and we'll see you here back in the classroom next Thursday.
From the church house.